Like on Mother's Day, we remember our mommies. And on Father's Day, we remember our dads. And on Thanksgiving, we remember a feast with the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. And at Christmas, we remember how Jesus was born in a stable. Well, during many of these celebrations, we have a special meal that we eat with the friends and family, and that meal kind of helps us remember. Because what would Thanksgiving be without turkey and dressing? Or what would a birthday party be without a cake? It's the food that helps us remember the event or the person. Well, today's Bible story tells us about one day when Jesus ate a special meal with his friends. You see, it was time to celebrate Passover. And we've talked about Passover before. And we're going to talk about Passover again. Jesus asked two of his friends, and their names were Peter and John. Jesus asked Peter and John if they would go ahead of the group and get a room ready for this really special Passover meal that they were going to have. They asked Jesus, well, where do we go? And Jesus said, I want you to go to the city of Jerusalem, and you will see a man carrying a big jar of water, and he'll have a room in his house that we can use. So Peter and John, they took off to the city of Jerusalem, just like Jesus asked. And when they got to Jerusalem, well, they found that man carrying that jug of water just like Jesus said he would be. And so they went up to the man and they said, do you have a room that we could use for Jesus for a special meal for his friends? And the man said, I certainly do. Follow me. So Peter and John followed the man to his house, and he took them to the back of his house where he had this room that he told them they could use. Jesus arrived a little while later with the rest of their friends, and while they were eating their special meal, Jesus picked up a piece of bread, and I want y'all to think about communion in church. Jesus picked up a piece of bread, unleavened bread. Do y'all remember unleavened bread? Jesus picked up the unleavened bread and he said a prayer. He said a prayer and he thanked God for giving him that bread. And then Jesus gave a piece of bread to all of his friends that were sitting at the table. And he said, do this in remembrance of me. And you know, in church, when we have communion, Pastor Will picks up the bread and he holds it up, and as he breaks the bread, he says, do this in remembrance of me. That's exactly the same thing that Jesus told the disciples at their Passover meal. And after he gave me the bread, he picked up a chalice and he poured some wine in a cup, and he took the cup and he thanked God for that juice. He said a prayer to God and thanked him for it. Then Jesus gave some juice to all of his friends sitting around the table, and he said, the juice in this cup can remind you of a promise or a covenant. Y'all remember we talked about covenant? A covenant is sometimes called an agreement, or a covenant can be called a promise. Jesus' friends didn't really understand what he meant by that, but the Bible tells us that that promise he was talking about, this is so great, y'all, the promise that Jesus was talking about is that Jesus will love us forever. Jesus loves you, and he loves you, and he loves you, and you, and you, and you, and you. Jesus loves every one of us. And it was that promise that he made to his disciples that night at their first Passover meal together. Sometimes in church, we have that special meal, and we call it Holy Communion. We have special bread, just like I showed you. We have special bread and a special drink during the communion. And when we do this, we're remembering Jesus. We're remembering that meal that Jesus had with his friends. And we remember that Jesus loved his friends, and he loves us too. He loves every one of us. Jesus wants us to have this special meal to remember his life and teaching. Remember we talked about how we associate turkey and dressing with Thanksgiving? And we associate birthday cake with birthday dinner. Well, this meal is like a gift that Jesus gave us to help us remember him when we celebrate Holy Communion. We celebrate this once a month here at St. James, the first Sunday of every month. Pastor Will has Holy Communion. And it is a time for us to remember Jesus. So, when you go up front for Holy Communion the next time, what are you going to think about? Jesus loves you. That's right. So think about that when you're standing at the front of the church and you're waiting for Pastor Will to hand you the bread. You think about Jesus. Well, now this story really talks about two meals, because I call it the Passover meal, but didn't I already tell you a story about a Passover meal? And that wasn't the same story, was it? That first Passover meal we talked about was the last meal that the Israelites had in Egypt before they ran for their lives. And that was a special meal. Well, when Jesus celebrated the meal with his disciples, he gave a new meaning to it. It wasn't their last meal in the city of Jerusalem. It was a very special meal. And he wanted that meal to help his disciples remember his life and remember his teaching. And there's that big word again, covenant. Remember their covenant or their agreement with God. And in our tradition, we remember Jesus through that second meal. We don't call it Passover. What do we call it? The Last Supper or Holy Communion. You're exactly right. And our lesson today asks us to remember Jesus often. And our verse today comes from Luke 22. Do this in remembrance of me. Remember I told you when Pastor Will breaks the bread, he says, do this in remembrance of me. And we're still in the New Testament. And what's the New Testament